Buenas tardes, good afternoon. Bienvenidos a ¿Qué pasa, Mujer? Welcome to ¿Qué pasa, Mujer? Estamos hoy celebrando el primer domingo del mes. We're celebrating the first Sunday of the month, and we are celebrating Black History Month aquí en los Estados Unidos. Aquí en Estados Unidos celebramos el mes de la herencia afroamericana en los Estados Unidos. Entonces, hoy es el primer domingo del mes de febrero. También vamos a estar celebrando Valentine's Day, el Día de los Amistad y Enamorados. No sé cómo es el nombre oficial. Y también es el cumpleaños de mi amiga Valentina, que es el día de los San Valentino, Valentine's Day. También es el cumpleaños de ella. So there's a couple of things that we're celebrating this month and we're looking forward to it. Esta semana, bueno, cada mes, el principio de cada mes, at the beginning of each month, we should, just kind of be touching bases with our goals and our objectives for the year, so that we don't wait until November or December, to make things happen. So estamos evaluando el mes de febrero, que es un mes nuevo. Entonces vamos a recordarles que sigan viendo sus metas para que no esperen hasta noviembre o diciembre para evaluar cómo pasó el año, o qué hicieron o qué no hicieron. Entonces, los estamos apoyando para que cada mes vean sus metas y evalúen cómo estamos. Una de las cosas que yo uso como una pizarra que puedo escribir y borrar todos los meses, y ahí escribo mis objetivos, también escribo las cosas que tengo que hacer de ese mes, pero también me gusta anotar una o dos cosas solamente que tengo que hacer ese mes. So one of the techniques that I use to kind of stay on top of my goals, I just have like a whiteboard erase that I update every month, and I just write down just one or two things that I want to accomplish for the month, even though I do a lot of things during the month, but it's just two things that I want to accomplish for the month. And then I also have a calendar in my kitchen just to kind of show me all the activities that I have to do for the month. And as you guys know, I'm a basketball mom, so this is basketball season. So we have lots of games all the time. So we just, try to stay organized and stay goal-oriented, and making sure that if we fall short, we give ourselves grace and then just keep it moving, because that's what we have to do. We're human beings, we're not robots. Today we have a very special guest. I'm very excited because it's a hot topic right now, and sometimes we don't tend to have hot topics here. And I am wearing my t-shirt. I hope you guys can see it. It says "Such is life," because I say that all the time to my students, because they come in here complaining about, oh my God, she pushed me in the bus. So I'm like, well, such is life. Keep it moving. Let's go. So, but yeah, so let me go back to my guest today, our guest for today. We're going to be talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion today. And we're going to go ahead and bring Maddie on before we bring our guest, so we can kind of get started talking about this hot topic. Hola, Maddie, ¿cómo estás?
Buenas tardes. Doing good. Hope everybody is doing well. And welcome to ¿Qué pasa, Mujer?
Sí, gracias. Dinos un poquito, how was your week? The good. Just the good.
Let me see. The good.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's anything good. No. I mean, we survived. I always start with that, made it through the week, and I will probably say just blessed. Today is my daughter's 26th birthday, and last night I was wrapping gifts, and I got to bake her a cake, and left it on the table for her at midnight, so that to say happy birthday. So just kind of I would say just blessed that I'm able to celebrate one more year with her. So
yeah, te estás poniendo vieja. You have a 26-year-old?
Yo, ella se está poniendo vieja, no yo.
That's true. Well, Maddie, today we have our guest is Vidal. We're going to go ahead and bring him on. So we're going to get to, I don't want to do like a big introduction, which we never do, Vidal, for our guests, because we get to know each other as we ask, our nosy questions. I'm very excited that you're here. I've encountered Vidal in a couple of business settings, so I don't know a lot about his personal life, but we're going to find out today.
Oh boy.
We were talking with our producer, there's no boundaries here when it comes to our conversations. So
Okay.
I hope you're prepared for that.
I'm
Um,
ready.
but we're very excited that you're here today. We're going to be talking about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I just want to, we could like dig in quickly. If you could just tell us, like, what does that mean? Because a lot of the times we hear those buzzwords, but we
Mhm.
don't really have true understanding of the meaning.
Yeah. Hello, Maddie. It's actually very great to finally meet you as well. I've been hearing great things about you. Um, Diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI, it actually has multiple definitions. And I think that's been one of the challenges. But typically, when you think about diversity, equity, inclusion, when you think about diversity, you think more so about representation, like who's present, particularly within a certain environment, organization. I work in higher education, so for us, it'll be in a school setting. Um, then equity. Equity is this idea, this concept of fairness, particularly if there is history related to excluding certain populations of people, including making sure that we have policies, different opportunities that are readily available, making sure that they're not biased in any ways. And then inclusion is typically this intentional way to engage folks within these certain environments, to actively include them in decision making, actively tap into their talents and their gifts to contribute in some way. So I define it and present it in this way, but I think the challenge is many times there's so many different definitions, and sometimes the world may not even live up to how we typically define DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah.
You may even begin to hear more, and I know you will, around belonging as well. So the ways that people feel cared for by their organizations, their corporations.
I read an article this week, and it was the perspective of how young people see DEI.
Yeah.
So, since you're in higher education, what do you think is the differences between, Maddie's generation looks at it versus the young people?
Maddie's young. That's a young generation.
I'm just messing with her.
Now, I will just tell you one big thing that we're seeing as more and more generations come in is that these young people are expecting not only to just talk about it, but they're expecting either their institutions or even their future jobs to hold that as a value in some way. Like these folks are social justice minded, so they're coming in making noise. So a lot of the things that we kind of learned in our older generations in terms of even the ways that we call ourselves or label ourselves. Our younger generations are coming in to really challenge that in a great way. So they have voice. They feel they have a right to voice their concerns. They're using one big difference now, social media, in a very different way. Where a lot of the work early on, we would hit the ground. We were organizing, making calls or just showing up in different locations. We have students now that they're using Twitter and Instagram and probably some others that I don't even recall to get together, to organize and to voice. And I think that's one of the biggest differences that we're seeing. And we expect that to get even more intense as more and more populations come in. And especially since they have social media and the internet, they're exposed to difference a lot earlier. So they're wanting to see that. But particularly the expectation that we express these values and we see that in the ways that we program or support populations. They're wanting that from us.
That's very interesting. So I have a 14-year-old and a 20-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
So my 20-year-old and their dad is African American,
Mm-hmm.
and so but they're very much in tune with their Colombian side. My oldest son, he drives. So as soon as we bought him his car, he put a Colombian flag, in the car. You would think he's in New Jersey because that's usually when they do that. But he's very proud of it, and I hear him talking with his friends, and they talk about culture in a so much more comfortable way
Yeah.
than our generation. So they'll
Mhm.
joke on him and, call him a Mexican, but it's like done with love,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It's never, they don't take offense to it or anything like that. And I just love that one of the videos that I saw when I was reading that article was, this is their norm, right? Their norm is to engage with people of different cultures,
Mhm.
different gender, different socioeconomic status,
Mhm.
divorced parents, married parents. So it's all of that, and they truly embrace, like, they have that expectation, as you say, like this is their norm, and they embrace it.
Mhm. And they appreciate that complexity.
Mhm.
So again, thinking about for older generations is primarily like, what are you? I
Mhm.
need a firm understanding of who you are. And it's usually probably some binary, well, you are this or that. You can't be an in between. But again, the younger generations are coming in just bashing all of that. They're intentionally not holding on to this whole box concept. I'm this and that,
Yeah.
and I appreciate that too, because again, one of the challenges of the work sometimes is that, or misperceptions, is that, well, DEI is only about race. Well, no, these students aren't even allowing that anymore. Students want to know about their religious and spiritual lives. They want to know more about gender in the roles that they have in society. They want to know about, as they get a degree, their social class may change. So they want to learn more about all these different elements. And so I appreciate that complexity that they're bringing. But I do think that it does create tensions with the older populations,
Mhm.
because we kind of like that defined way, because that's how we were brought up in some ways. We had a box to check, be happy with that box. Even if there's variation in the community or whatever, we just had boxes. And these young folks are smashing it. That's,
Yeah.
yeah.
Maddie, what is your perspective on this? Because Maddie has older children, and in Maddie's household, she and her husband have promoted Afro Latina or Afro Latino, right, Maddie? So have you guys had a chance to have conversations about this topic in your household?
Oh, we talk about it all the time. And I think, to backtrack a little bit, I think, everything that we're talking about, it's something that we live with every day. And maybe we didn't have a name assigned to it. Like, for
Yeah.
example, I say it because in my house, you're talking about my Afro Latinidad, accepting, the diversity of cultures that I am, that's makes me, in my house I have, like Viviana said, I have two 21-year-olds, my twins, boys, and then I have my daughter who's turning 26 today. We have a grandbaby, who's also racially mixed, and we all look very different, like I'm like somewhere in between. My daughter's very light skinned like my husband, and then my boys are way darker than me. So when you see us together as a unit, we look a little different, but same mom, same dad. So again, talking about diversity, to me is normal, because that's, I mean, like, we all look different even though we are the same. So I think, it starts with pointing that out, at home first, and then when you go outside, and we talk about, being immigrants coming to this country and trying to be accepted as well. We want to see ourselves represented out there, because that means that I belong. We always look for that acceptance factor. And I think the biggest difference between generations is that before, like you were saying, that, like, we accepted, the norm, and we didn't question it. You were told you are this, and we accepted that. And then now it's like, the newer generation is constantly asking, am I only that, or am I more? Because I see this and I see this difference, and I see this and I see that, and they want to know more about what makes them them. And then lastly, I would probably say they have a voice. It's like, again, us being, older, being female, being, an older generation, we kind of learn to stick to the stereotypes, and we don't say this, we don't talk about this, you don't question this, and then this generation, it's like, we can talk about it. And if you don't want to listen to me, I can go on social media and post it, and the whole world can listen to me, So I think that's the biggest difference, that they're being empowered to be able to speak their mind, which is good and bad. you know, it's good and bad, because
Hmm.
sometimes, you know, they're able to, you know, what's in their heart, but also, you know, sometimes say too much and kind of cross that line. So I think that's where we come in, the older generation, to try to kind of try to keep it a little bit centered. But I wanted to ask, that, like you said that you're in higher education. Tell us a little bit more about yourself, and, you know, kind of what you do, and how do you end up as a DEI specialist?
Oh goodness. Um, I'll actually start from early life. So I'm originally from Tennessee. I was sharing that earlier, and we were talking about birth order and things of that sort. And I actually, when I'm asked that question about how I got into DEI, I actually think it started with my family life and how and when I was born. So one quick thing. So my mother, single mother, young mother, and I'm an only child, but I had herds of cousins to follow, and we lived in the same home. So to me, still even to this day, you know, their children are my nieces and nephews. So it was kind of like this brother cousin or thing that we had going on, which is common in a lot of generations, you know, a lot of communities. Um, but before I was born, every eldest child was a girl. Um, and so what was interesting is that when I was born, because I was the oldest, I took on a lot of things that many thought were kind of the gender things, but really they were the things that really older kids had to do. You know, so I was making sure I was looking after all the cousins. I was cooking earlier. Um, Grandma made me responsible for finishing her quilting. You know, I just, you know, a lot of gender things, but it was like the older person took those things on. And so that created a very different experience for me, especially compared to my uncles and other cousins. And so I was looking at things differently. Um, I had uncles that were military, so they intermarried, and so I remember for a number of years, um, my Latin American aunt, my tita, born in Mexico, um, my two cousins, Ronnie and Mike, all of us were in the area, so we were seeing difference in engagement, and so I was always curious about that because I only knew what I, just as you said, Maddie, what I was told in terms of being blackness and being a man. But when I think about the work, I think it was just those early seeds. I was so curious about culture. I was always curious about identity. And then I always loved learning. I love being a student. But when I entered college, I did struggle because I was the first in my family to actually attend college. And so to move from a predominantly, particularly Black community and then to a predominantly white institution, that was a struggle for me. And I did find refuge at what was called an office of well, it was minority affairs then. Um, and then to discover that, wow, not only am I being served in this way and finding a home here, that's a career. How can you do that? So I've been intrigued, and so I began to pursue it early on, in my young 20s. How can I help and support individuals who had similar experiences to me? We saw a similar thing working with international students. I want to do that. I want to serve in that way, and so just continue to um, find opportunities in education. But I think the other thing is too, um, I even was more curious and began to look at ways that we can talk about it and engage even broadly in the community. So I'm here, Maddie. I'm trying my best still. It is a difficult time at this point, but I feel all the more committed to the work, particularly because it involves um, populations that sometimes feel vulnerable and unsafe, who've had histories of being disconnected and not engaged in society overall. And so I see it as a service in a great way.
Yeah, one of the things that I have found so interesting that you've really schooled me on was the evolution of the census. I love that topic when you discuss that because it has evolved so much and how people are called, right?
Yeah.
So I wanted you to talk a little bit about that because I just find it so interesting, and also the connection of what was going on in history at the time that they
Mhm.
started to use different words to describe different people.
Yeah. And I began to use for a number of reasons. And because even now we're so stuck on terms and labels. that makes it hard for us to communicate. So do I call you Black or African American? Do I call it? And in all these terms, sometimes they're synonymous with some folks, but sometimes they're different. And what I found is that we didn't know really the histories of the terms that we were being attached to. And so I taught a course early in my career called Race and Ethnicity in the United States. And it was actually the students' curiosity about these terms or their alarm about certain terms that I said, let's take a look at it. Let's kind of walk through it. Yes, absolutely. Hispanic and Latino as well. And then all the variations now, because I'm so curious. I want to hear from you too about the Latinx versus Latine and all these other things are evolving. But one of the things that are important to consider is that it wasn't just that folks were just changing terms, or one or two individuals doing that. Things were changing as things were changing in society, particularly as we begin to have experiences with different populations, different communities. So if you think early on, I think the first census was 1790, it was only used to count free white folks, free, what they call free persons of color, or people of color, or free colored persons, and then also to count the enslaved at that time. So it's very much sometimes accounting, but also a record keeping of property. But things began to evolve. I mean, the census began to evolve and have a different purpose, particularly as you're trying to get an understanding of who was in the land and who were in the country. But it was fascinating as years went by. Some terms were based on political agreements. One that's fascinating to me was one with Mexico. It was a guest employee program called the Bracero program. And it started in 1942. Now, the thing is, we had Mexican Americans in the United States before then. But at that time, the terms were different. Sometimes they were considered white. Sometimes they may be considered othered. And believe it or not, very similar to some indigenous or Native American tribes, they may have been considered Negro or Black because we just didn't have another category. So it varied in some ways. But because of the agreement, there was a period of time where Mexicans were intentionally called white because it was requested of Mexico, a part of the government, to make sure that they weren't discriminated against and they could actually access certain rights just as the whites. And so part of the Bracero program was actually it ended up being almost like around 5 million Mexican men. And I emphasize it was just men because there are even interesting things around that and what that meant too. But bringing them to the United States to contribute to, primarily it was agriculture, but they helped with the railroads and other things. But that was one example of how relationships with the government or an entity, it wasn't based necessarily on just looking at skin color and heritage. It was a political connection or a political label. And then, of course, if you think as we advance, imagine just it became complicated. Folks were intermarrying. We had additional nations coming. So what do we call these folks? And so one of the things we talk about in the class too is we talk about the term mulatto that came up, where even there were political pushes to include that term. And one of the pushes actually came from science. There was a racial scientist wanting to explore. He was actually researching kind of Black and white people, but was curious about the combination, the mix of Black and white in a person and their behaviors. And so pushed to actually have that term mulatto in the census because we wanted to see who was here and how to identify them. But then mulatto got messy because you also had, although it was intended to kind of identify those with African heritage, it was kind of being applied to every mixed anything within the state. So it became messy. So they removed it. Then they brought it back, but also think as society progressed to, we had more interactions with other countries. We also began to see as individuals and communities were in the United States, they began to, I'm going to use that term, added voice, began to organize, have an influence within government. So they were contributing to the ways that they were named. You began to see a big surge in terms, especially from the 1960s upward, because of power movements, and folks, saying that, hey, we want to be known as that. The term that you're using doesn't fully represent who and what I am. Now, I do have to say this too, because we do explore this, and I want to make sure I'm not talking too much again. So make sure you
Oh,
keep
I
that.
love it.
The other piece is and I'm talking about it in an almost clean way, but it's never been a perfect tool. But it's something that we use and is operational. You think about the census, we got to get ready for it. We got to get ready to check those boxes. But it's not a perfect tool. Like even when you think about the category of maybe ethnicity versus race, it's fascinating how we may use Hispanic and Latino as the ethnic category, but all the others, like Asian American and all these other terms that may be associated with a region or culture, they're all racial terms. So it's not perfect. Now, I think we know how to respond to society because we check the boxes, but it becomes tricky when you think about how we interact with each other, the inconsistency in terms, even terms that, again, communities don't identify with. One big one was many didn't realize how long the term Negro was a part of the census. That didn't disappear into the 2000s. And folks are like, what? Yeah. And part of that was because, many older members of society, older Black community members, still connected to that because to them, early on, that term Negro, although it's odd and old and, antiquated now, that was a new term for them. It was a term that they understood. It's a term that they connected to. And as long as they were living, they were still, aligned with it, and that was the case for a number of others as well. So terms do evolve. I think it will continue to evolve just as we're talking about these younger generations. I've been curious about particularly Hispanic, Latino, Latine, Latinx, all these other terms that may be coming that particularly younger generations are looking at and begin to question in some ways, particularly those terms that may be rooted in what they're identifying as colonialism. Like these are terms that you have placed on me because these folks came here and colonized, and my ancestors are part of these groups. And this is a term you're laying or placing on me or imposing on me. So
Yeah, I think Maddie does a great job with talking about culture. Just the different conversations we had.
Yeah.
But I know, like for me, like I was born in Colombia, so there was no, we never had those conversations of like Afro-Colombians exist. I didn't learn that till my 30s that they existed. Did we have a couple of Black people in my family? No, everybody was like my complexion or a little bit darker. But one of my aunts did have a goddaughter, and she was obvious Afro-Colombian, but it was never talked about because she just came over and she ate like the rest of us, and we talked to her because we had the language in common, right?
Yes.
And the culture, and everything was the same except her skin color, so we didn't see a difference. But I think it's what you were saying, and like what Maddie was saying, is what we're told that we are. So I know there's a show on YouTube. It's called Black in Latin America, and it was done through PBS. And I just love the series of that because it truly shows us the connection between Blacks and Latinos. Because in my world, we're the same, right? We come from the same place. So there's a region in Mexico. Because if you ask me, I'll say I'm Colombian. I don't tell you about the color of my skin. I tell you that I am from Colombia and I'm Colombian. And there's a region in Mexico where if you ask them what are they will say I'm Black. They don't say they're Mexican. And it's because that's what they've been told. That's the culture that they've lived around to say that, right? So they've been trained to say that. And they're very much in tune with their origin, with their foundation. And I just find that very interesting. I know when my kids, both of my children were born here in Virginia. And I don't remember the exact boxes that were there. My son is 20, the other one is 4. I don't remember it. I don't remember having this sentiment with my 14-year-olds, but I did with my 20-year-old because I wasn't on the box. Like there was nothing on the boxes that identified with me and my child being mixed. So I either left a blank or I created my own box. I don't remember which one I did, but I felt kind of upset that I couldn't identify or that they didn't include me in their box selection, you know? And so some of those things, because I even wonder, in the future of the census or other forms, because even in today, like even in 2024, 25, there's places that I've gone to and I don't feel identified with the box. So I select other.
Yeah.
My option. And I feel that DEI isn't covering me at the moment. So yeah, I love this topic. I love the work that you do, Vidal, because it's so impactful. It doesn't matter how old you are, it impacts all of us. And I wonder what is that box going to look like, because now you have so many people mixing with so many backgrounds, like even the mother is something and the dad is mixed with two things and the dad is mixed with three things. So I guess we have to get comfortable with the other box. What do you think?
Well, they are expanding the categories. Still not perfect, still not perfect, but they are allowing, at least for identifying with multiple boxes. There are some that are a little more specific, where they may look at the region or ethnic group specifically. And it's so interesting. I didn't print it off, but I even try to maybe look it up right after this so I can send it to you. But there was actually a report. They did investigate how Hispanics and Latin Americans were checking boxes in the 2020 census. Whether they were not identifying with a race, were they identifying with multiple, were they identifying with the other box? And so I think it was interesting because, again, still imperfect, but looking at the boxes, you said, Viviana said, wait, none of these identify with me. And so the study was, well, how do they respond? Do they not check any race at all, or do they actually put multiple or put others? But it did include the stats in there. So I just did a quick scan of it, but it is available. It just came out like December. So just as we're talking, I think they're seeing too, wait a minute, we have this broad category of Hispanic and Latino, Latin American. And it's like, but many of them aren't checking it, or they're not, or they're checking these other pieces. And so I wonder what that report is going to do in terms of how it expands. So they did expand the Black category or African category, where you can go deeper into different ethnic groups, even the white categories that begin to expand as well. Asians had broad categories, but again, I think all these areas will begin to expand. I think it's still important. It's still an imperfect tool, but it's one that's used to allot resources. Maybe that could be a better way, but I think what the tool also does, it forces the box. And one way to make sure that they're counting and they're doing research and there are not too many other variables involved. They force us to these boxes that they create. But I agree with you. I do think it would expand, and I'm just curious about at some point, when you have so many boxes in place, what is the value of that category, or how will it evolve in some ways so we can still understand who's here and what they need as being citizens within the states? Yeah. I don't know who's guiding that. So when you said it was a DEI thing, that's, I think, what made me curious about it as well, because a part of my work, when I think about diversity, is very broad in who engages, but to have communities feel that they don't see themselves in a document that's to represent their presence in the country, that's big. That's a big thing. It can be jarring for a lot of folks. And then the piece that is also alarming me is that even with this larger census piece, even internally, we're seeing with communities, they're making dividing lines of who is and who isn't. Someone who was born in the States versus those who immigrated. And if you did immigrate, you went through certain processes, et cetera. So we're even creating lines within the community that is making the work a little harder for us. Yeah. But I'm still here. I'm still committed to it.
That's all we can do. Keep pushing. You know, I think one of the things that I always say in the show is that that's why education is so important. We have to educate ourselves because I mean, we're human and we continue to evolve, and everything continues, to move forward. And it is up to us to be up to date, to educate ourselves, to be aware of what's going on, outside. I think, with the Hispanic. Sorry. I'm sorry, my baby got excited. I think with the Hispanic population, one of the things that happens is that sorry, he's standing by the door and he sees the cars going by and he goes crazy. So with the Hispanic population, I think one of the biggest things is that there's certain things that we don't talk about. Like Viviana was saying, we don't talk about race. And I think it's because a lot of the Hispanic countries, or the Latin American countries, we're so racially mixed that sometimes it doesn't make sense to have a conversation about black or white, because I have, like I said, I have 3 kids and my boys are black and my daughter is white, and they're mine because I birthed them. They came out of me. So it's like, why are we having this conversation if we are brothers and sisters and we have the same mother?
Yeah.
So when you have families that are like that, my mom came from 12 siblings, and you look at the 12 siblings and they all look like a rainbow, because you have the white with the straight hair, the white with the curly hair, the brown with the straight hair. There's a little bit of everything. And how do you have a race conversation with 12 siblings? So there's certain conversations that you don't have, and then you move to a country like the United States and you're here, or you're born here. In my case, I say that I'm Dominican, but I was born in the United States. I grew up in Dominican Republic, but I was born in the United States. You're forced to label yourself and address yourself as a certain thing when that's not a conversation that you have at home. And again, the benefit of the doubt to the people that haven't been exposed, you have, the white people that have only been exposed to one certain type of people, and then all of a sudden they're faced with like all these other differences, and it's like, okay, what are we calling this? What are we, because I've always been this, but this is different. What do we call that? So I think it's about having those conversations. And when you're not used to having those conversations, and then you have to label yourself, something, it's hard. I always talk about that in my poetry. You'll learn later that I'm a poet, but in my poetry, I talk about that because my mom was very white, and then my dad was darker, and then we're like a shade in between. And it's like, I remember, the first time I had to fill out a form, and it was like, what are you, black or white? And it's like, what am I? I come from a white mom and a black dad. What am I? And it's like not having that box on there, or not being used to labeling yourself a certain thing. So again, it's education, is having those conversations. But at the same token, is how do you change the mind of the older folks? Like, how do you have these conversations with your parents? And with other members of the family. I always tell the story. I got a tattoo in my back, and it's a crown, and it has a sash, and it says the word black in Arabic. And I remember when I did my tattoo, I showed it to my brother. He was the first person I called, and I showed it to him, and he's like, oh, it's beautiful. What does it say? And I said black, because I'm a black queen. And the first thing he said is, since when are you black? And I was like, again, having those conversations. And, I'm like, have you looked at yourself in the mirror? We look exactly the same, So, but again, it's something that, and I think also he lived in New York, and in New York, there's so much diversity everywhere, and I'm living here in Virginia. And then where I live is not as, I'm not going to say that it's not as diverse, but it's not as normal as it is in a place like New York City. So I've had to face and label myself, a certain thing. but I'm proud of it at the same time. It's not necessarily a negative thing, because I was going to say that's another thing, and I want you to talk a little bit more about that. The labels are great because we are able to identify ourselves and kind of feel represented, which is what we're talking about. But sometimes those labels are used in a negative way. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
And so I appreciate what you just described too. One of the ways I describe these terms, I call them operational. I mean, they exist and they work in some way. And again, being citizens, we've gone right along with them. We know how these terms are used. Even if in your home or even in your own workplace or whatever setting, those terms and labels change about you. We're just in this place where we get our cues and we just go accordingly in some ways. Now, one of the things that I do worry about, particularly when we think about labels, is that it is a concern because you brought up generational, and it's a multi-generational element because, again, depending on, and you can even look at this in your own family, depending on when they were born, they were labeled something possibly different. Like even when I think about my family, if you go back, decades, I have the freedom, or at least, I'll say free. Well, I have at least the access to use a certain box, and to also have been labeled a certain way on my birth certificate, where others before me, have certain labels that, again, were aligned with where they were in society. And it is interesting that it's not only just the terms that are, kind of applied, and this is what I'm getting to the challenges that you're asking about, Maddie, is that when we also begin to apply how we look, how we act, how we speak, where we live, all these things are attached to these categories, these racial ethnic categories, and there's too much variety. Then so many elements of us may change, in some way. And I think that's one of the biggest areas where it becomes a little frustrating, particularly for younger folks that are looking at, and they don't feel the same grip that we may have felt earlier in life. Also, if you think about generations, and I'm thinking specifically within the States, the census has a history of just maintaining these boxes. And it's also another way that I describe, when people say it is more than just black and white. But if you look at the census, it started with black and white, and it's continued with black and white, like centuries later. So when he's like, it is more, yes, it's more than black and white, but it's also something that we just relied on, because again, that was a start, and it's been a tool that we've used. And it wasn't a perfect tool, even an incorrect and messy tool that we've used. The other thing is, and this is what's been concerning me some decades before, but also even now, the challenge is too, since we use the census kind of to identify folks and develop resources, many don't trust the tool, especially if I'm concerned that I may be misinterpreted in terms of my immigration status. What is this census being used for? Why are you asking questions about my employment? Why are you asking all these questions if you just want to do a count? There are some deep and personal questions, particularly old generations are like, why do you want to know my business? But there's a fear sometimes associated with that. Completing this because I don't trust it. And we're still finding that, particularly with older generations. But then younger generations are saying, we don't want to complete it because it's been a tool of oppression for us. So again, what's going to happen to this tool and how can it evolve? Because now you have labels that don't align with me. Then now we have a tool that, again, we don't trust. But then the larger question is, who determines what I call myself? The government maybe shouldn't be doing that. But again, I'm stuck in a place where I'm forced to use these terms, again, although they're operational, that just still don't align with me and who I am. And particularly as you think about our communities and how they evolve, language changes, people change, our history changes, because again, younger generations aren't as attached to, particularly in the States, kind of the hardships that were once associated with folks who were in the States early on. So those who went through the power movements, they feel a certain way about these terms because they fought for them. Very different for younger generations who now are, again, experience certain freedoms where they don't necessarily have to align um, in the same way because, again, they have had the access to call themselves or even change the language that's been outlined before them. So I know I went all over the place with that, but you all are striking some good stuff for me. But I do.
We're gonna have to bring you on for another show.
Hey, you know where I am. I would love to.
There's so much to talk about. And, when you were talking to me, that it triggered how I've heard Hispanic people say, I check off like I'm white because white people get more stuff. They have more resources. So I'm going to check off white. Or even our producer was saying about the Native Americans. Sometimes you want to label if you do have some Native American blood, you want to label yourself that because you might be able to tap into some resources that you wouldn't have access to if you didn't have a little bit of that American Indian Native American blood. So yeah, I think, and it's all about what Maddie was saying, right? Just educating yourself. And that's what we try to do here. And we try to encourage our viewers to just educate yourself, because sometimes even though we're Latino and Hispanic, our own people don't know the difference between the two. And so it's big to educate yourself and not just, like when I rarely watch the news, but when I watch it, I try to watch like different stations and then feed different articles, because I don't want to just go by this one perception, right? Yeah. And I just think it's important for us to really educate ourselves. And when it comes to the census, we had a guest a couple of weeks ago, and she said, like you said, it's not a perfect tool. So she said, even with the last census, a lot of people didn't want to even fill it out because we were going through COVID or coming out of COVID, and they were afraid, to touch papers and stuff like that. So how accurate, is it was the document this last time? And then also in reference to like even the financial piece and the fear factor that you were talking about, how we are fearful of filling out those documents because they're asking for too much information. Yeah. And then another thing that you mentioned as well that was triggering, because my brain is going everywhere. But a couple of years ago, a long time ago, this is before I had children, so like over 20 years ago, I went to see a play in New York called Plátanos and Collard Greens. And they were mainly talking about Black people and Dominicans. It was based on Dominicans solely, but, I took it as everybody in Latin America. But just how we are in this thing of just dividing ourselves. But we're the same. Like, I encourage people. There's a book called Open Veins of Latin America. And it talks about the history of how the Europeans came to what we call South America today. I own a tutoring business, right? So sometimes people come to me to learn Spanish or English, and I always give them the culture. I always tell them, like, we're all like, this was like, it was divide and conquer, right? So I have those conversations because at the end of the day, we're all the same people. If you really look at it, I was like, Native Americans, like the same thing that happened up here happened in the South. But we all come from the same. If you look at Native Americans from Colombia versus the ones from the United States, if you just look at pictures, they look the same. So I find that so interesting.
Yeah. And it's fascinating too, because I worry in some sense, how who we are just so linked to history and how we've traveled, either outside of the States and within the States. But how that piece of us is being challenged, even by individuals who just are not necessarily just about DEI, but just who are resistant to certain just aspects of history. Like, for instance, I'll just give you an example. I'm trying to keep up with the conversation around, and it's called delineation. And it's occurring definitely within the Black or African American community, but also with our Latin American community as well, where they're thinking about, well, since I've been here in the States for so long, I don't have any connection to Africa. So why would I call myself African American? Why would I even associate with anything African when that's not a part of who I am? So now, back in the day, particularly when you think about civil rights, you hear more about diaspora, where it's like, I'm Black, this is my Black experience here, and there could be another Black experience in Brazil. It could be another Black experience in Puerto Rico. But there's this idea of some connection in some ways. But now there's some resistance to that. Similar thing. I was watching, it was fascinating. I hope no one's offended by this, but I've been watching City Council in Chicago. It has been just interesting because immigration issues around funding, et cetera. But one of the concerns that came up within that space, within the Latin American community, were concerns about the ways that individuals have immigrated and how if there's this sense that there's competition for resources. And I think that's real for a lot of communities. They feel that there's this competition for presence and support and maybe even recognition in some ways. And I worry about these ongoing tensions that we're seeing internally. So yes, I want to connect, and I see this commonality with folks, but there's also this tension and fear within our society right now that's causing our own to butt heads with each other, and have them redefine or create lines about who and what they are, even along their histories. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, what are the because our time is almost up, but
Yeah.
what are some fears that are happening at the moment with the work that you do with the change of administration that we've had?
Sure. One of the big things, particularly as you think about the higher ed space, higher ed has been one of the what's been called sensitive areas where organizations like ICE could just enter, if there were concerns about immigration stats and things of that sort. But that was taken away. One of the other challenges is really about how ill-defined or undefined things are. So you'll hear language like unlawful DEI practices. What are those? We don't know what that means. So one of the things that's of concern is that really the government hasn't defined DEI in terms of the lens that they're using to modify, change, exclude, and get rid of some of the types of programs that are in different sectors. So it's almost a sweeping view or lens that they have when it's inconsistent. So for instance, a lot of the work that we do within certain DEI structures includes disabilities. It includes, again, working with those who may be the first in their families to attend college. I do some support around folks who transition from the foster program. So it does vary from organization to organization, community to community. It's defined differently. But the fear is that since those in power have this very kind of narrow understanding and definition of it, they're sweeping across and eliminating things that are for, in fact, broad communities. And then, of course, the fear of losing money, funding, losing jobs. If you cut the types of programs that exist in different, like what are those cuts? Because some of those cuts and those different programs are helping communities to feel connected to different environments, helping them to feel safe in some ways. That's where their support comes from. So if those go away, where does that support go? Who supports these communities? Who supports their presence? Who supports their voice in these different areas? So again, it's so broad and undefined. So when you're dealing with the kind of the unknown, you're just anticipating this day when you just get a call that, hey, this work, this money, this support is no longer.
Right.
That's the biggest fear, I think, Viviana. It's just this unknown. When the other shoe drops, how deep will it cut folks? And no one knows how to prepare for it, really, especially communities. Vulnerable communities, especially, like they're just waiting for almost an attack in some way. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, very interesting. I just, I go back to what Maddie was saying. We just really need to educate ourselves,
Yeah.
because things can happen, quickly, and we have to be prepared, to act. For us to have children that are in higher education or just regular elementary, middle school, and how it affects them, because it's not just affecting the Latino community or the LGBTQ. It affects people just throughout.
Yeah.
Just kind of making adjustments and because it's about having equality, right? To make sure that everybody's being treated the same. Like I know one of the conversations Vidal and I had with one of the classes that I attended was even in the business world,
Yep.
you coming in here, making sure that my office is equipped for larger people, make sure that I have
Yeah.
chairs that fit larger people. So that's part of DEI, right? And we don't think about it in that capacity. But I just think that the work that you do is amazing, Vidal, and we definitely have to bring you on again,
I love
because
that.
there's so many other topics that we can discuss, because we want to educate. One of the things too that I know we didn't talk about money, but we say this. Well, I say this on every show, just to empower, because I think it's about empower. When you get educated, you're empowered, and it gives you kind of like that swag, to walk around, to be able to have these conversations with people that are clueless, and it's not to pass judgment on them. It's just that they don't know. But Latinos contribute $3.4 trillion to the economy. And I
Yeah.
know I've said this to Vidal before because I said it in class, but that's what we do. And I just think that it's a massive number, and it's probably not a very accurate number. The numbers are probably higher, but I think it's important to know the data, and that yes, it could be tweaked at times. And with statistics, people manipulate numbers all the time, but there is some truth to the data that's given. And I just think that we definitely have to bring you on again, because I love the topic, not just because it's a hot topic right now, but just in general. I love the evolution of the census. I think that has been my favorite class that you taught, because I was like, oh man, I never thought about that. But yeah, I love that you were here today, and I thank you for coming on and sharing your time and your knowledge with us.
Thank you. I really appreciate the time too. Nice meeting you too, Maddie.
Yeah.
So thank you, and much success on this. This is a great platform. So I
Yeah.
really appreciate your allowing some space for me, but would gladly come back, especially as things continue to roll out related to this work. So more is to come. And so I
Yes,
appreciate the
I love
conversation.
it. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. So
Yeah.
we're gonna go ahead and get started. So you can warning, Vidal, you might have goosebumps, okay? Because that's the type of poetry Maddie does. So typically, especially when she does her bilingual poems, I definitely get the chills. So we'll see what she has in store for us. But we're ready, Maddie.
Wonderful.
No pressure, right? I just kind of, before I go into my poem, I just kind of want to piggyback a little bit on the topic. And again, it becomes about education. Like we were talking about the word Hispanic versus Latino versus Latinx. Again, Hispanic, people that were colonized by Spain and speak Spanish, countries that speak Spanish. Then your Latinos are people from Latin America that don't necessarily have all the countries that speak Spanish. We have countries that speak other languages too. And then you come into the Latinx, is because you're talking about gender equality. So again, it's about having those conversations. And when you feel empowered to have those conversations, the labels are going to change. So talking about that, the poem that I'm gonna read today, it's in my book. It's called A Vision of She. And I wrote it because, I'm always constantly faced with the question of who am I or who are you? So hope you enjoy it. Thank you again, Vidal, for being with us. So who am I? I come from a seed imported from a faraway land to satisfy the colonizer's curiosity of what could blossom from my inside. Yet my kind will forever be unknown, strange fruit that will never be understood. Because I'm a contradiction of what they see versus what I taste like. Bewitching the palate, convincing the brain, the eyes have been lying since the beginning of time, because I am a flower that was deemed to bloom in any garden, even a concrete one, like a parasite that attaches to its surroundings in order not to die. Survival of the fittest. I, Gloria Gaynor, the ish out of this life. I'm a survivor, a child destined to thrive, to be remembered. Words are immortalized in this poem so that I never forget I have to stay working hard. You see, they keep pushing back the finish line, thinking giving up will be my only choice, but they keep forgetting where I come from, that I am as much colonizer as I am Taino, as I am slave. that I can muscle my way through the finish line, or I can verbally slap you with my intellect in Espanol and English. Yes, I get tongue twisted time and time again, but that's from all the verbs that I have bending in my head. I can call you hijo or son of a, all in one breath. I'm sorry. Excuse me. I keep forgetting what I was gonna say next. Concentrate. I am concentrated coffee before it became Americanized. Café Dominicano like the Caribbean sun. I will always shine. I am black girl magic passed down from my black grandma through my white mom to get a clear picture, a mix of different races. That is how Dominican I am. I am the dopest line in this poem that made you want to say, rewind. I am the exact vision of the future my ancestors had. I am the point of reference next generation will always look back at. I am a mother, a daughter, a poet, a sister, a friend. I'm a work in progress. I am the promise that I made to my past that my future will be great, but in the present, I'm still downloading, and I can't wait to show you all what I have coming up next.
I love it. Thank you, Maddie. That was like right on point. Oh, and then we forgot to acknowledge our viewers. Of course, Lily Matos, Nikauri Jackson, Valentina Rojas, our people from Colombia, Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, New Jersey, New York, everybody that was watching and listening to us today. But yeah, thank you, Maddie. I hope you have an amazing week. Mark, I hope you have an amazing week as well. And we will see you all next Sunday at 4:00 Eastern Standard Time. And rest assured that we would have Vidal back again with us at another time. So he's going to be on our regular list. So thank you, Mark. And I hope everybody has a great week. Gracias.
If you're watching this with your friends, you'll probably make a joke.
Because you know what you feel on the inside
isn't what you want people to know.
If you have to pretend to be happy,
find someone you trust and tell them.
If you get mad at things and you don't know why, or have thoughts about hurting yourself,
find someone you trust and tell them.
You are never alone when you share.
Seriously, people care about you.
It's okay to not understand what you're feeling.
And it's easy to think that you're all alone.
But you don't have to be.
You're never alone when you share.
Don't be ashamed to tell someone you trust what you're feeling.
You're not alone.
You are not alone.
Find someone you trust and tell them.
Tell a parent.
Tell a teacher.
Tell a brother or sister.
Or just tell a friend.
You haven't done anything wrong.
Talk to someone.
Talk to someone.
It's how things get better.
Whether you're a seasoned designer, dabbler, or just starting out, this course is for you.
Are just so impressed with them. Like I said, we've been with them for years. I will recommend and refer anyone to them. We stand by A+ Academics. They're the best.
A+ tutorial really did help me with all my grades. They all went up when I came to this place. And I would say I recommend this school to everyone.
So it's a really good environment to be in, especially for me because it makes me look up to my parents.
If you have students that need academic help, A+ Academics is the place to be. A+ Academics, what a great place to go for academics.
It's just a really great place to learn.